Yes, good. Okay. Well, Daniel Trilling has written a series of articles about the current refugee crisis, which contains some of the most trenchant and eloquent criticisms of the system that I've read, apart from the other people who've been speaking here today. And his book is coming out next year, early next year. And so I'll ask you to say a few words just about, in general, what you think of what you've heard today. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Marina. So, I've spent the last 5 years doing reporting work on refugees in and around the European Union, which means I've focused on following certain individuals or groups of people over the long term and have followed people as they've moved through different countries. So I've got to see what living conditions are like in a quite wide range of different camps, centres, accommodation, prisons in some cases. So throughout today I've just been listening to what everybody else has had to say and just thinking, well, how does that relate to things that I've seen and what might be useful to bring up from that. So that's what I'm going to talk about now. So, and apologies if this is either very boringly prosaic and descriptive or it's stuff that you know already. But I thought one thing that struck me was that apart from the first presentations this morning where we had some quite detailed descriptions of specific situations for refugees, one in East Africa and one in the UK, there hasn't been that much of a conversation about who the people we're talking about are, who are refugees, and also what is a refugee camp. And I just wanted to reflect on those two things. First of all, so refugee has got a whole range of meanings. I think two of the main meanings that come into people's minds when the word is mentioned is one, it's a legal status or eligibility for that legal status, which is international protection under our system of refugee law. The other is a more colloquial sense in that it's somebody who's been displaced by conflict, has fled a war or persecution, which may in some cases not actually qualify them for that legal protection, or they may not have asked for it, so they might not be legally a refugee, but de facto, they're somebody who has been displaced and fled abroad. And I think that's quite important because often, particularly when Europeans talk about refugees, it's with one eye on Europe's refugee crisis of the last few years. The assumption is that it will be lots of poor brown people coming from places in the Middle East or Africa to Europe wanting something from us. Just to throw something in there to complicate it, one of the largest groups of refugees in that colloquial sense in Europe today are Ukrainians. There's somewhere between 1 and 2 million Ukrainians who have left their country because of the war in the east there, who are at the moment living and working in Europe. Now, one of the reasons we don't consider them refugees is because Ukraine has got a work visa arrangement with the EU that allows people to come to Europe for periods of up to 3 months without having to apply in advance. So although there are lots of displaced Ukrainians in the European Union, there aren't big camps, there aren't huge, long, hand-wringing pieces in Sunday newspapers. People aren't proclaiming the death of the West because we've got lots of Ukrainian refugees on our doorstep, and so on. And I think what that points to is one of the reasons why refugees end up in these prolonged situations of transit or containment is because it's not just about experiencing a war and losing your home. It's also a specific political problem. So you might wonder why has there been so much effort put into doing things for refugees, creating storytelling workshops for them, sending various kinds of aid, a big outpouring of sympathy when, say, you haven't seen the same response to the big rise in homelessness, street homelessness in Britain so far, or the ongoing situation of Roma people around Europe. And I think that's because being a refugee also points to a specific political problem, which is that in theory, we live in countries that proclaim a rhetorical commitment to universal human rights, but in practice, those rights are still guaranteed by membership of a nation state. And when you're displaced across an international border, you either literally or effectively, in many, many cases, lose your ability to access those rights. And what states often do, because they want to control immigration, they often want to prevent people from the countries that are producing refugees from migrating at all. So Europe has spent 20 years building this huge complex border system in order to keep out as many unwanted migrants from Africa, the Middle East and Asia as possible, is that states will find ways to contain and keep refugees separate, from stopping them from settling, from engaging in kind of meaningful activities of citizenship. And the refugee camp is just one of the ways in which this happens, I think. So I think in many people's minds, a refugee camp is this thing, like Ben described this morning, a vast settlement that seems temporary but may actually go on for many, many years, somewhere out in the desert that possibly involves rows and rows of tents, that has got very restricted material resources, where the inhabitants have to create a kind of makeshift society away from big cities. And that's certainly the case for many people, but it's not the only kind of segregation and keeping separate that happens to refugees and people who travel in search of asylum. Others, as we've heard already today, are things like detention centres. But I think there's also this kind of less immediately obvious sort of segregation that happens, particularly in Europe, and I think actually particularly in Italy, where people are not, for the most part, kept in large camps. I mean, if you think about around Europe today, the only places where you would see those proverbial large tent city type refugee camps would be in Greece or other parts of the Balkans. I mean, people might point out that I'm wrong there, but what happens for the most part is that people are kept in various kinds of reception centres that are often quite small. And I mean, I've noticed from reporting in Sicily and southern Italy quite a lot, they will be officially part of a town, but very often quite geographically segregated from the part of the town where people come and engage in sort of social and political and cultural activities. So I don't know Palermo that well, but I've spent a lot of time reporting on the east coast of Sicily, and the reception centres around Siracusa, for example, they're within the municipal area, but they are a 2-hour walk from the town centre, which contains all of the things that the refugees actually need to be able to access their rights, like the police prefecture office where they need to go to sort out documents, even shops that would sell things, say that Nigerian refugees who've come from Nigeria, food or other items that people might want. And another thing that came up today was this idea of people living very precarious lives when they're in this situation of transit. And again, I just wanted to run through a couple of examples of precarity that I've noticed, and just suggest that this might inform how you think about how, if you're creating any project that involves working with refugees, how this might affect the outcome of the situation, or how they perceive you or how you perceive them. I mean, probably one of the most important things when it comes to precarity is legal status. So people are on temporary documents, they don't have documents, they're waiting for asylum applications to go through. They might have been given some form of protection, but it's limited, so they say, well, you can stay here for 2 years, but it's going to be reviewed at the end of the 2-year period. I think that creates an immediate power imbalance between someone who's got full citizenship coming into a situation and working with anybody in that situation. I think something I notice very often from being a journalist going into that situation is people are always thinking, well, are you going to help me? Perhaps if I cooperate with you, if I'm more forthcoming with my story, this will somehow benefit me, it will help me get those rights that I don't currently have. The other thing that can happen is that they may be very worried that, by talking to you or opening up, they're going to compromise themselves in a way that will lead to them losing their rights or being prevented from accessing more rights. And then because when people are claiming asylum or they have uncertain immigration status, they're often barred from working. It means that people feel like you know, they can be very anxious that they're not earning a living, they're not supporting their family or other dependents, they're not living a dignified and independent life. And I've had this happen several times, where it means that people can get very frustrated at the fact that they get all of this attention, but none of it is what they really want, which is a job or a house. So I can think of, for example, a woman from Nigeria that I've known for a few years, who was in Sicily and has now gone elsewhere in Italy. And, you know, she arrived determined that she was going to kind of give her, you know, she went through this horrible journey from Libya to Italy, and that she had told herself, if I survive, I'm going to do something that gives my life meaning. I'm going to become a women's rights activist and raise awareness of what's happening to women in Libya. I'm going to do all these cultural events and really help other refugees feel a sense of pride in themselves. And she went from organisation to organisation trying to do this, and they would always say, yes, please come and do this, or come and join our demonstration. And she ended up getting very, very, very frustrated, because she would say, well, in the end, it just feels like they all just want something from you, and they're never going to pay you for it. And what she wanted really at the end of the day was somebody to just give her a wage for some kind of work. 1 minute. Okay, so the other things that come up with precariousness, I think, are more practical things that I hope people are aware of already, things like health, mental health, the risk that people who have got PTSD can be triggered by things you do as part of creative projects. And I would say that an awareness of that and training for what to do if that happens is as essential as knowing basic first aid if you're, you know, a classroom teacher or something like that. And the last thing that I tried to think about was, because we've been talking about storytelling, and I think this morning Marina emphasised the importance of collective storytelling, something communal as opposed to what people might be doing, you know, on their phones alone, and actually getting people out of that shell and breaking that loneliness. So I was thinking, well, are there ways in which people that I've met while reporting are already engaged in some form of communal storytelling? And would this be useful for you all to know that, because it might give you ideas about how you could build on what's already there? So the things that I could come up with, and I'll run through them as briefly as possible, are, first of all, as has been mentioned a couple of times today, I think the experience of being a refugee and of claiming asylum involves constant storytelling. So not only to people who are assessing your asylum claim, but the incredible amount of media attention. I hold my hands up here because I'm part of that, but always going and asking for certain kinds of stories. So going into a refugee camp and saying, I need, you know, this kind of person who's come through Libya and had this kind of experience. Have you had that experience? Okay, no, you're no good to me. Have you had it? Etc., etc. There's also the stories that people on these long and difficult and dangerous journeys tell or create about themselves for survival. So one example I could give is of an Iraqi woman who ended up stuck in Calais it was before the big jungle existed, but was stuck there with her 3 children who were under 10 for about 5 months in a camp run by Kurdish people smugglers. And for the whole time she had to pretend to be Kurdish, even though she was actually Arab Iraqi, because they had told her she had been told when she arrived that these smugglers really didn't like Arabs, and because she was bilingual she was able to pretend to be Kurdish. But I think that's a kind of particularly vivid example of something that a lot of refugees are engaged in. You have to change who you are to get past an obstacle or survive a particular kind of situation. And then technology itself. I would suggest it's worth not discounting phones and computer technology and the internet entirely, because yes, it can lead to isolation. Often, and I'm sure anybody who uses social media here will know what that's like as well. But it is a way of connecting with a community that you might be separated from, on the one hand. So something I've noticed when reporting in Sicily with like young men and teenage boys who've come from West Africa, for example, is that they're engaged, and through me befriending them on Facebook, I can see the way that they're engaged in a kind of conversation with people back home, their friends who they might have met in their initial reception centre who are now dotted around Italy or have gone elsewhere. And also in situations where technology is very hard to come by. So an example I'm thinking of here is a group of Pakistani men I know who were detained for 2 years in a prison in Greece. They had one phone between 50 people, and it became the communal thing that they would do in the evening, which is, you know, watch video clips, try and phone people, and the rest of it. And then the last kind of collective storytelling I could think about is, well, what are people already bringing with them? You know, if it's a refugee camp where it's a whole displaced community, then there is a culture and a tradition and a history already there. If it's somebody who's on their own and isolated and isn't surrounded by people from their home country, well, maybe they've brought something that isn't being expressed in the group environment that could actually really contribute to it. And then sort of related to that is the idea of kind of big historical narratives, which I think are really important. And I was speaking to Ben about this earlier, about how often I've found when reporting in Europe that from the refugees I interview, the narrative of colonialism and its legacy comes up, where people I have met in Italy will say, we're treated like strangers here, which we find infuriating and very odd, because Europe colonized our countries and our grandfathers fought for the French, and why don't they recognize that actually we're already a part of this society? So I think finding a way to bring in those grander narratives, and also recognizing that they might be different for the people that you're working with to the ones that we were told are important. And then just to finish, so I know that I have massively overrun. It's that going back to this idea that there's this problem of rights and of citizenship and of states trying to keep people segregated, I think we should really try very hard not to lose sight of the fact that even though these situations of transit and containment and being in camps or reception centres might be prolonged and might force the people living there to make do and come up with all of these ingenious ways to get around not having access to money or you know, material goods and the rest of it, it is a situation that doesn't need to exist in the way that it does now and should not exist in the way that it does now. And I think a good question to be asking ourselves, particularly if we're going in and doing creative and cultural projects, is something along the lines of, is what we're doing, you know, you wouldn't expect any one project to solve everything or to do anything particularly huge, but a good question to keep asking is what we're doing helping people to liberate themselves, or is it effectively decorating the bars of their cage? And I think it is worth constantly asking that. And it's one thing that's come up in some of the ideas for projects today where I think that question is particularly pertinent is the idea of junk and bricolage and making do. And I would just ask, you know, why is that appealing to us? Would it be appealing in the same way to somebody whose 2 cars and 3-story house were blown up by ISIS, you know, 5 months previously? Or somebody who lives in a camp where there's running sewage, you know, in the middle of the road. They live in a tent. Everything they own is junk. So I will end it on that not particularly helpful question. Thanks.
So the point now is to engage in a general discussion, although Daniel's been so eloquent that it may well be that people want to ask Daniel questions or just kind of bounce off the things that Daniel has mentioned. So, reflections on the day or on what Daniel has just said, or both? Yeah.
I might just pick up on that last point you made, which I thought was very provocative and interesting, and does address the kind of aesthetic that a lot of us have been playing with. And one thing that we were discussing a bit when we were putting together our models and ideas was the idea that for traditionally in the culture that most of us come from, culture has been separated out in some sort of more refined realm. You know, if you think of the space of the museum or of the church or the concert hall, there is that separation that a lot of us perhaps take for granted, and it might be worth thinking about that. You know, is there a way of creating something that is special and apart, and whose materials indicate that? because there is something that's pulling us in the other direction that is probably the legacy of the Bauhaus and places like that, that idea of the everyday and of the, recycling and that. But I think it's important to remember that is an aesthetic, that is a matter of taste to some degree, and that has a history as well. It's not just straightforwardly the right thing to do.
Also not necessarily the wrong thing to do.
No.
I don't want to sound like I'm saying, and anything that I've said is like, it should be done one way or another, but I think just knowing why you're doing it, or being aware that you are doing it.
I think that's a very salutary comment you made. But I would like to just defend the idea of what I was thinking, my view particularly, was that some way of thinking about how to go about things to sort of maybe even lighten something that we have no idea how it is, but also not to sort of maybe even spend necessary money on what might be vital on things. And recycling isn't it something that you can take ecologically, for everyone. And I think that sometimes the things that connect people, and sometimes they're just the pain of loss of a parent or a pet or something, across all sorts of divides. It might sound a bit wank. In fact, I don't think it sometimes is. And that quite a lot of the conversations, and I was very struck by the Jacaranda and the whole ethos in Palermo of people allowing themselves to converse with much, like what I call as funny old white people, just very openly across subjects like football or other things that were shared. And a lot of the emotional sort of stories of loss, you don't have to be so particular to share. And I think that sometimes actually the ecology of the planet is one of those subjects. And so I would go totally with what you're saying. It sounds a bit very colonial. Oh, let's just play with junk. But actually there is something, and there is something in the tradition of arte povera and other traditions that aren't just about just being rich enough and privileged enough to play in the dirt and among the rubbish, but something that psychologically opens up and connects and also reflects ecological recycling today, which is a concern for us all. That's
I would just say that I'm not, I don't know whether I'm meant to be chipping in or not, but anyway, who cares? I think that what really upsets me about sort of Brico chic is that it gets glamorized, the Instagrams of, the colourful shack, the repurposed petrol can, whatever. I mean, I'm absolutely fine about recycling, and I know some people don't even have the choice. That's just how they do things. But when it gets printed in these big magazines that are that thick on glossy paper, and it's next to an ad for a hotel in the Seychelles or something, it's pretty sickening.
Well, I think that sounds sickening and disgusting. I don't see those magazines. I mean, I'm really coming from a very European tradition, I suppose, of post-war, sculpture and ideas. But I think your point is so important that it makes me shiver a bit. But properly good shivering.
So how do we deal with that? I mean, how do we deal with that? I mean, because in a way it negates a lot of what we've been talking about and trying to do.
I think it's possible to work with very, very, very cheap materials and give very, very, very high production values.
Yes.
So that when you're creating something of actual beauty that can be appreciated by all who make it and who are witnessing it. But that what we don't do is make things in a slapdash fashion. That you actually attend to some skill and creativity into it. And there is also the idea that we're not just hopefully doing this the once, but that we're giving people the ideas and skills to carry on doing it.
Themselves.
With no budget.
Yeah.
If there is
But
no
if
money.
there's no budget, then what you do is to, you can't even buy a cheap material for no budget. You have to use what you find. You have to use what you find.
When we were working in Palermo last time, I think it was cheaper for me to buy a violin because I was doing some music stuff. I decided it was probably cheaper to try and buy a violin there than pay for my pay for me to have baggage and the holes on the player, and it was. So I ended up buying a cheap violin and working with the boys. I didn't really think about it that much. Initially it was just that was the decision. And 3 or 4 of them immediately grabbed onto the idea that, you know, they were showing me on their phones that they play these 3-string fiddles in their villages. They took what is a sort of quintessential European, historically quite posh thing and immediately made it their own. And the music they produced was really interesting wherever you were coming from. And it was a brilliant sort of pivot object that was quite tangential how it arrived. But I realised that if we could look for things like that, they were so proud to have this thing because it was relatively valuable. I was just so excited because they could actually play this instrument. And then we had this really nice dialogue because I then changed my violin technique so I could sort of play with them and we had fun. And I think if we can find that kind of object, perhaps that's also... And we could have made a story about that too. I just wanted to throw it in as I thought that was actually a moment, sort of something that was quite exciting on both sides of what we were talking about and didn't cost very much money. And it's still there being used.
Can I just... no. Sorry, that's maybe tangential, but I agree entirely with that. I thought it was really exciting how they picked up that violin. You brought, and they played a piano that was hanging around.
True.
And wondering about possibilities for actually creating a space for music with a number of instruments that they could access and play, because it seemed to me that there's a very innate sort of musical sensibility in coming from their different traditions, different countries which all have different and rich musical traditions. It seemed like a very sort of fertile ground for expression for people, if only those instruments were there. I think it'd be very easy to gather instruments and take them. I mean, I know lots of people who give instruments.
Yes, that's...
I'd like to ask Clelia the question.
Yes.
We did that workshop on Gilgamesh with very little props and like basic. What was the feedback of the people we did it with? Did they think, oh, they were making fun of them because we were using bits of this, or did they think, wow, it was very creative? I mean, I don't know. What was their reaction?
No, they were very happy to have these possibilities to make the theater in Gilgamesh. And one of the results is also Dukerenda, because they start to think that they can invent, can act. And some of them had some experience like this also in their countries. They made some theater in the school with friends. So it was very naturally and very amusing to join this idea.
So, I mean, I think it's about our attitude. It's not just so much about the things we use, but how our attitude when we are doing it is like, I think that is the thing, is like, you know, having been once a refugee a long time ago, it's the attitude that you have towards the person. I'll give you one little example, because I know my friend here liked one of my examples. When I first went to Australia without papers, and I tried to get, for a long time I was a paperless kind of student. I started doing cappuccinos, and you know, I come from a middle class family. My father had a very big position, but I decided I'm not going to fight, and I wanted to flee, and I had an opportunity to go and study in Australia illegally, but I did. So what happened is, I was doing this cappuccino weekend job in order to make a little bit of money, because no other money would come. And this receptionist doesn't know a thing about me, or, you know, I'm doing my job very nicely. And she says, Wolfo, do you know what a theater is? And I just say, yes. She says, because I've got 2 theater tickets and I could, it's like she assumed because I, you know, was doing cappuccino cappuccinos on the weekend and I was struggling financially that I didn't know what the theatre was. So, you know, it's the attitude we have towards, and I will always remember that, you know, and that's 40 years ago. And so it's the attitude when we are dealing with these people, not to assume, you know, backgrounds, and so it's this kind of thing, I think, rather than I use old string or I use paper or I use...
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Sorry, it's just a little bit so convoluted story, but this is a good example of our preconception that you might see these beautiful smiling boys and assume things. We can't. You know, we can't. I was very fat in those days and you probably assumed I come from some, but no. I knew what theatre, I went to theatre, I saw lots of wonderful things, but this woman assumed I don't know what the theatre is because I was a refugee.
And whereas you'd have probably been pleased and you know, impressed if she just said she wants some tickets to the
Yeah, if she think, oh wow, there's something fun, blah blah blah, but she assumed I don't know what the theatre is. Yeah.
Just while this conversation was going on, I was reminded by David's comment in his presentation about remembering that Olsen is a provocation and not a model. And I wonder whether that's some way of thinking or dissolving this potential kind of debate about whether it's okay to use kind of the techniques of bricolage, montage, which is, you know, you can see that in the Jacaranda kind of memory cards. There's the collapse of high and low art in their work. And I wonder one of the things we did in the two workshops we went there was rather than say this is how you have to make art, we hopefully gave the young men some kind of ideas which then they've kind of completely transformed and actually made some quite beautiful objects. So I think as long as in our work we don't say all you're allowed to work with is kind of rubbish and junk because that's what your object or theatre piece or poem has to look like, but there's some principles and provocations by when you think about you can make something beautiful about the world around you rather than necessarily having to have cultural institutions already set up. And that's the only place you can make art. I think as long as you remember that these ideas are, you know, about mixing cultures, about cutting things out of magazines, about ripping up words, are provocations about art rather than models, then you're on safe ground.
So one second, is basically reminding each and every one of us that are participating in this activity that we are all creators. We can all create.
There's a you want to come in or can I?
That's it.
There is a complicated question here, I think. So refugee status it has one very clear demand, which is to end indefinite detention. Okay. And then its ambition is, if that ever happens, to make another demand, which is people who are here seeking asylum should be allowed to work for exactly the reason that you're saying. But then there's two intermediate questions. One is, what do people do in the meantime? Okay, not detained, not allowed to work, long periods of time. A very necessary thing that it's possible to provide is kind of voluntary opportunities. That's a meaningful thing to do. It's both a humiliating thing and a meaningful thing to do. But then the other question is, what's the thing that would tip the argument so that politicians or whoever is informing opinion might say, yes, of course they should have the right to work because they're people just like anybody else and everybody needs to work. And that's where it seems to me cultural activity comes in, because that's the point at which a community is being developed and faculties are being demonstrated, and all of the claims that a person has on another person can be brought to bear. And so, I mean, I think it's dialectical in a sense. I don't really see going straight to right to work just because you can make one can make the argument eloquently. As crucial as that is, there are other things that are necessary to kind of gain purchase on the argument, I think. But.
Yeah, or another way, maybe another way of looking at it is, it just reminded me of how, I think, Valentina, you mentioned earlier, you referred to Palermo as being like a busy city for refugees. So they wouldn't...
Partly, of course.
Partly. But like the project we were discussing in our group, it might not be so useful to them because they've already got all these other things to do. But that made me think, why wouldn't it actually precisely be in like the busy place that this kind of intervention is really useful, because it's got the potential to draw in people who aren't refugees as well? Like that actually this kind of sharing and playing these games is a way of doing what you were just talking about. Like that while the politics is not changing, you're able to intervene in people's lives and make those arguments.
And this came up in all of the model building, which is one of the questions is what's the space that you're going towards? So there's a space where the community tells its own stories, but is there also a space where whoever is in that situation is telling that story to somebody who isn't in that situation, which is a visibility question, I think.
Can I I was very taken with the young men that we heard on Skype, and they mentioned about their group work, making them a new family. They were like brothers, and so they sort of formed a family through working together in this way. And I really like the idea of, although it was very playful today, this idea of the materials and skills, not only of working with materials and bringing people together, but also that some traction would come out of it, that skills are built on that they could take further. And I think that is really important to have quite skillful things going in, because then they could be built on. But at the same time, there's this lack of hope or movement. So I'm very conflicted about sort of offering skills as if somebody's going to be doing something else soon and they can use these skills outside this confined place. But you have to have hope that it will propel them. And at least whilst they're there, they can exercise the muscle of imagination so that they can imagine how they might use these things, even though they're in an incredibly frustrating position. But it's very awkward in lots of ways. But
that awkwardness can actually result in something very warm. Because you can offer a thing that's unskilled, if you like, if you want to look at it in terms of technique or technical construction, where some of those guys had all those skills. So really what you're doing is an exchange, and you're giving something European, and people of a certain generation grew up with parents who did everything, made everything. And it was all make, do and then, and it is therefore a very different kind of take on it from something of your generation, that only one of us knew how to make things last, and it had to be done, it was morally important. And that is a different way of coming across trash. There wasn't trash in that way, always, everything was reused. And I think that recirculation is not morally reprehensible, and I think that the skills is a very important exchange, because I certainly worked with guys there who had the skills I didn't have. They could easily work things, they could have built a construction, a house, we could have lived in, and I couldn't. But I had something else, and it was European in a way, or whatever. And it was different, it was offering an exchange, wouldn't you say? There was an exchange with this funny old generation, and it was, you could see from colour and age and voices that you could see it outside as very colonial or something. But, it could be discarded as that. But in fact, that was an opportunity that wasn't just that, I thought. But, I don't know how other people felt it. I thought it was...
I think we've really run out of time, but can we make this the last comment, please?
No, I think that the space that many times comes out during this day is really important, because you are right, in many parts of Italy and also in Sicily, the reception centers are in the middle of nothing, are totally segregated. In Palermo it's better, because we have something like 70 reception centers, but normally are apartments with 15 boys more or less. So they are spread all over the town, and many times also in the high class part of the town. So they can live with all the other young people, and they stay with everybody. And all of them go to school, so they receive 18 or 20 hours per week to learn Italian and also other subjects. And that's why also because they don't feel inferior, they don't feel, and they have the attitude, in some sense, to colonize in a good way, because they say, I see that you need Jokerenda. We export our values here because you need. You see the attitude. And just to give also another example, because I teach also in the Faculty of Law, I decided to create a meeting between the unaccompanied minors and the students of the law, Faculty of Law. And the idea was an exchange between these two kind of students. But I have the picture, maybe I can show you, but immediately the leadership was in the refugees' hands. You can see the picture. They stand up and they teach, which is the law about refugee, asylum, and everything, and also about the consequence on their life. So, but this is because they are, of course, they are special guys, because you cannot survive to this kind of experience if you don't have, if you don't come. Use every source that you have in some sense. But this is the situation in Palermo. Two of the guys, Ibra and Mustafa, that they spoke, at one moment they were moved in a reception center in a mountain. Unfortunately, there are many. They are a hotel. They didn't have any business because it was not very charming places, and they were converted in reception centers. But around there is nothing. And when they arrive in the center, they remain totally surprised. How is it possible? People live here for 1 year, maybe more, and they cannot say one word in Italian. They are totally depressed. They are very bad. Also, the mental disease are growing. They were totally astonished by this. And luckily, a colleague find a family for them, and they can leave the center and now they live with an Italian family. But they feel very guilty because they say other two guys came in our place, and we know there are other 60 boys in that center. So the space, if it's a segregated space or crossed place, makes really the difference in the end.
Thank you. Marina, would you like to just wind up
just
with a few words?
Yes,
well, I can't tell you how, it's been incredibly inspiring. So I thank you all very, very much. I do want to thank the team from the Ruskin case. And also Rahila and Antonia, who did all the logistical work. And Clelia for coming from Sicily, and also making a huge effort to get visas for Marga and Dean, which we failed to do. But nevertheless, they put a huge amount of effort into it. So thank you very much.
Can I say from all of us, Marina, thank you so much for a fantastic day.